People hike for different reasons, for health, for clarity, but for me, I just wanted to be alone. To clear my head after a betrayal, I was miles away from anyone who could hear me if I yelled. I had finally gotten my wish. But when you discover you're not actually alone out there, when a stranger starts moving in the dark behind you, that silence becomes something else entirely. I was 31 when this happened. I'd just ended a relationship I thought was heading toward marriage. Finding out she'd been seeing one of my closest friends hit harder than I expected. It left me feeling restless, like I needed to put as much distance between myself and everything familiar as possible. So I took a cross-country trip. One of my stops was a remote stretch near Mount Hood National Forest. I chose an unmarked trail branching off an old access road because I prefer routes that don't see much traffic. Fewer hikers, fewer conversations, more time to think. I drove until the road narrowed into gravel and parked in a clearing. Before stepping out, I checked my phone. The network was weak. Exactly what I wanted. I downloaded the offline map, marked my location, and started toward a ridge lookout roughly 4 miles in. The terrain was steep and uneven, but manageable. About an hour into the hike, the clouds rolled in faster than expected, and a cold drizzle began to fall. I've never liked hiking in the rain. After debating it for a few minutes, I decided to turn back. By the time I reached the clearing again, it was late afternoon, and the light was fading. That's when I noticed something was wrong. All 4 of my tires were completely deflated. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. There was no debris nearby, no sharp rocks, no clear reason. And the clearing had been empty when I arrived. An uneasy feeling settled in. Someone had been there. I scanned the tree line carefully. The forest was damp and still. No birds, no wind, just water dripping from branches. The silence felt heavier now, like it was pressing in from all sides. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The access road stretched for miles, and I couldn't remember exactly where reception had dropped. Walking it in fading light didn't feel like a good option. The ridge I'd originally planned to reach was the highest point nearby. If I could get there, maybe I'd catch enough signal to call for help. So I went back into the woods. That's when I started hearing footsteps. At first, they were faint, easy to dismiss. But after a while, I noticed something strange. When I stopped walking, the sound stopped too. When I moved again, it returned. It felt timed, intentional. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. But the deeper I went, the darker it became. The drizzle softened into mist, and the trail faded into shadow as evening slipped into night. The trees seemed taller somehow, closing in, blocking out what little light remained. I glanced back. At first, nothing. Then movement, a shape shifting between trees. Too tall to be an animal. A person, maybe, or more than one. It was hard to tell. They never stayed in view long enough. I kept walking. The forest grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural. By the time I reached the ridge, it was almost completely dark. And I checked my phone again. Luckily for him, the network has returned. Although it was just 1 bar, I immediately called local authorities, gave them my coordinates, and explained the situation as calmly as I could. They told me to stay in a visible area and that someone was on the way towards the access road. Relief helped, but it didn't solve the problem. I still had to get back down. By then, it was nearing midnight. I didn't want to retrace the exact same path. If someone had interfered with my vehicle, they might expect me to return the same way. So instead, I moved slightly off route, curving back toward the clearing from a different angle. For about 15 minutes, everything was quiet. Then a twig snapped to my right. I turned quickly. Nothing. A few moments later, I heard whispering. Low, indistinct. Just enough to know it wasn't wind. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just one person. There were several. I picked up my pace. Through the trees ahead, I noticed a small clearing I hadn't seen before, logs arranged in a circle around what looked like an old fire pit. It seemed recently used. I didn't stop. Behind me, the movement became clearer. The footsteps no longer tried to match mine. They were getting closer. At one point, I looked back and caught sight of multiple figures spaced between the trees. Their clothing was light-colored, almost blending into the dim surroundings. One of them stepped slightly forward, then slipped back again. They weren't calling out. They weren't warning me. They were just following. My walk turned into a run. Branches snapped behind me now, and I could hear movement spreading out like they were adjusting their positions. It felt coordinated, like they were guiding where I went without ever getting too close. The clearing with my car finally came into view, and beyond it, headlights. A patrol vehicle sat there, its beams cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. I ran straight toward it. When I turned back, the tree line was empty. Nothing moved, nothing followed. The officer told me assistance was already on the way. When I explained what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. He said that in some remote areas, there are people who prefer to stay hidden and avoid outsiders entirely. He said I was lucky. Maybe he was right. But here's what still unsettles me. If they simply wanted me gone, they could have made their presence known earlier, in daylight, clearly, directly, and instead, they waited. They waited until I was isolated, until it was dark, until I had no easy way out. And then they stayed just far enough away to let my imagination do the rest. Now, whenever I hike remote trails and hear even the faintest sound behind me, I don't ignore it. Because sometimes in the backcountry, the real danger isn't getting lost. It's realizing you were never as alone as you thought. There's a difference between hiking alone and realizing you might not be the only person moving through the trees. And when you think you're finally getting some peace and quiet, only to be interrupted by a sound that doesn't belong to any animal you recognize, it doesn't just make you nervous. It makes you wonder who or what is out there with you. And once that thought settles in, it doesn't leave. It lingers in the back of your mind, turning every small sound into something suspicious, something intentional. I've been hiking for decades, not professionally, not competitively, just obsessively. I've covered most of the major trails across the US, and I've spent years deliberately seeking out places where other hikers don't go. Recently, though, I got bored. Marked trails started to feel predictable. So I developed a habit. I'd scan satellite views on Google Maps looking for massive, unnamed forest sections, the kind that don't show trailheads or parking lots. That's how I found a restricted patch of woods near the settlement site of a renowned politician. Technically, parts of it aren't open to the public. That should have been my first sign. But in my mind, off-limits meant fewer people, and fewer people meant I'd be completely alone. I entered around noon, giving myself plenty of daylight to explore before dark. The first thing I noticed wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't hear. There were no birds chirping, no insects, no rustling of trees, just absolute stillness. It was the kind of silence where you start noticing your own breathing, where even shifting your weight feels too loud. The kind where your boots moving against the dirt sound intrusive, like you're the intruder. I placed my route markers as I went. I use small adhesive tabs at shoulder height so I can follow them back out. As I pass them on the return, I remove them. It's efficient and keeps me from getting lost. About 40 minutes in, I realized something strange. I hadn't seen a single animal. No squirrels, no deer, nothing. It made the place feel deeply isolated. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that didn't feel natural. I kept walking anyway. Eventually, I pushed that feeling aside, convincing myself the trail just had a different ecosystem. Maybe it was seasonal. Then I heard it. A low, drawn-out wail. It wasn't close, but it wasn't distant either. It carried through the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint direction. I stopped walking. The sound rose again. Not quite animal, not quite human, just wrong. I told myself it was probably a wounded deer or wind funneling through rock formations. But there was no wind. The trees stood perfectly still. Even the leaves didn't move. I turned and walked the opposite direction until the sound faded. That's when I noticed the carvings. Deep marks in the bark of a tree directly in front of me. Not initials, not random scratches. They were deliberate. I scanned the surrounding trunks and found more of them, spaced out in a way that almost felt intentional, like they were guiding something or someone. That's when I felt it, that creeping realization that I might not be as alone as I thought. I decided that was enough for the day. I turned back, removing my markers as I went. But about 15 minutes into my return, I stopped cold. One of my markers was too low, waist height. I never placed them there. I crouched and examined it. It was mine, but someone had moved it. The adhesive edge was still fresh, slightly lifted as if it had just been repositioned. My heart started pounding. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. Still, the silence felt different now. Heavier, like it was waiting. I walked faster. A few hundred yards ahead, something new caught my eye. A dark opening in the earth. It looked like a shallow cave or hollowed den tucked between rocks. I was certain it hadn't been there before. The angle felt wrong, like it revealed itself only when I was close enough. Then it clicked. If someone lowered my markers, they could guide me anywhere. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. Someone had been following me, not randomly, methodically, and repositioning my markers, steering my path. A stranger in the woods, watching, waiting. The wail returned, louder this time. It echoed in a way that made it feel like it was right behind me, even though, when I turned, I still saw nothing. I started running. Branches brushed against my jacket. My breathing sounded too loud. Every step felt amplified in the silent forest. And then, behind me, I heard something else. 3 sharp knocks. Not from a door wood on wood, like someone striking a tree trunk. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a signal. That was the moment real fear set in. I stopped briefly and checked my phone. I pulled up the saved location of my car and oriented myself. Then the signal vanished. The wailing started again, overlapping with the knocking pattern. I ran harder. The worst part? The forest was still otherwise silent. No animals scattering, no birds taking flight. Just me and whoever was behind me. At one point I risked glancing back. I didn't see a face, but I saw movement, a tall figure slipping behind a tree trunk. A man, maybe. Or maybe more than one. The sound followed me almost the entire way back. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I burst through the tree line into the clearing where my car was parked. The silence returned instantly, like nothing had happened at all. I didn't hesitate. I got in and drove off immediately. To this day, I can't fully explain it. The rational part of me thinks it was someone who saw me enter and decided to mess with me. Maybe he moved my markers and used some kind of device to create that wailing sound. But that explanation doesn't sit right. Because to reposition markers without me noticing, he would have had to stay incredibly close the entire time. Close enough to hear me breathe. And those knocks? They sounded coordinated, like communication. Maybe there's a reason that section of forest isn't open to the public. All I know is this. I used to seek out the most isolated places I could find. Now, when I hike and the woods get too quiet, I turn around. Because sometimes being alone in the backcountry doesn't mean you're by yourself. It just means whoever's out there hasn't decided to step into the light yet. You never expect the place that once felt like freedom to become the setting of something you can't explain. and you definitely never expect the sound of your own phone at midnight to turn a quiet night into something you can't outrun. When I was in college, my parents' house was still the default gathering place for my group of fellow collegians. Even though we were technically adults, nothing had really changed. My parents still lived in the same house at the edge of town, the one backed up against a stretch of woods that most people avoided after night fell. There were a few reasons everyone preferred my place. My dad's basement was basically a private lounge with a pool table, battered leather couches, old neon beer signs glowing against wood-paneled walls, and speakers loud enough to rattle the ductwork. My parents were relaxed about us hanging out down there. As long as we didn't break anything or cause trouble, they mostly left us alone. The other reason was the land. We lived on a large plot that bordered several acres of forest. If you walked through those woods for about 15 minutes, you'd reach a dirt service road. Across that road was the reservoir. Technically, civilians weren't allowed there. A tall chain-link fence circled the entire shoreline, posted with bright warning signs about trespassing and water safety. Over the years, there were a few unofficial openings in the fence, so many that the Water Commission eventually stopped repairing them. The reservoir had been my escape ever since my first breakup. I went there when I felt overwhelmed, when I wanted to smoke without being bothered, when I needed to think. Even as a collegian dealing with stress, relationships, and the uncertainty of what came next, I still went there to clear my head. It was quiet, beautiful, isolated. At least that's what I believed. One late summer evening, 5 of us were downstairs playing pool. Music blasted from the speakers while Chester attempted trick shots and failed dramatically. Rick and Hassan were arguing over something meaningless. Jasper was scrolling through his phone, bored. Eventually, Chester leaned against his cue stick and said, "Let's hike to the reservoir." The sun was already dipping, the sky turning that dull grey blue that signals the shift from day to night. It wasn't completely dark yet, but it would be soon. Boredom won. We grabbed hoodies, a couple of beers for the walk, and headed out the back door. The air smelled damp from earlier rain. The woods behind my house were thick and uneven, the ground soft with mud and fallen leaves. The deeper we walked, the more the noise from the house faded until it was just us, and the sound of branches brushing against our sleeves. I remember feeling uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the fading light. Maybe it was just the woods at night, getting into my head. We slipped through one of my usual openings in the fence and made our way toward the cliff on the near side of the reservoir. The water stretched wide and dark under the growing night, smooth and reflective like polished stone. We hung out there for a while, talking about nothing important. The sky continued to dim until the tree line across the water became a jagged silhouette. Eventually, and someone suggested we walk to the stretch we used to call the beach. To get there, you had to follow the curve of the shoreline, cut across a narrow bend, and continue along the opposite side. It took about 20 minutes. By the time we reached the far side, it was fully night. That's when Hassan froze. He lifted a hand slowly, pointing down the shoreline to our right. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe. But then I saw the outline of a person. He was emerging from the woods on the same side as us, maybe a few hundred yards away. The distance and darkness made it hard to see clearly. But one thing stood out. He was dragging something. We all went quiet. The scraping sound carried faintly across the ground, something heavy shifting against rock. As he stepped closer to the shoreline, we could make out a black bag that he clearly didn't want anyone to see. Chills ran up my spine. Could he be disposing of harmful substances from that lab my dad had warned about? Then 3 more figures stepped out of the tree line. 2 were dragging similar bags. The third carried a kayak over his head. My heart beat frantically. The first man slid the kayak into the water. The others helped lift one of the heavy bags into it. He climbed in and began paddling toward the center of the reservoir. We watched as he stopped midway. There was a pause. Then the bag slipped into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. He paddled back. They repeated the process. By the time he returned for the second bag, my mouth was dry. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it carried across the water. Then my phone rang. The sound cut through the night, loud, sharp, completely out of place. I fumbled in my pocket, trying to silence it, but it was already too late. All 4 men froze. Slowly, in unison, they turned toward our side of the reservoir. Even at that distance, the change in their posture was clear. They knew someone was there. For a split second, none of us moved. Then Chester whispered, "Run." We didn't argue. We bolted. Branches snapped beneath our shoes as we tore down the shoreline. Mud sent Jasper sliding into Rick. Someone cursed. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close they were. Halfway along the bank, Rick glanced over his shoulder. "They're coming," he yelled. That's when adrenaline took over. Running through woods in complete darkness is chaos. Every tree becomes an obstacle. Every shadow feels like something stepping into your path. The ground dips without warning. Roots catch at your feet. I realized with a jolt that I couldn't remember exactly where the opening in the fence was. We reached the chain-link barrier, breathing hard. I grabbed it and started moving along it, hands dragging over cold metal, trying to find the gap. Behind us, a branch snapped. Closer this time. We were no longer just watching something strange. We were part of it. "I can't find it!" I shouted. Then Rick pointed ahead. "There." The opening was only a few feet away. We pushed through one by one, scraping our arms on bent wire. I shoved Chester forward and stumbled after him. As my feet hit the other side, I heard it. Footsteps approaching the fence. They were fast, and if I were in a good enough state of mind, I'd make a joke about them sounding furious too. We sprinted through the woods toward my backyard, lungs burning, branches whipping against our faces. When we burst out of the tree line and saw my house lit up in the distance, relief hit. But it didn't erase the tension. And it certainly didn't make me feel safe. We ran through the back gate and up to the house. I lingered by the sliding door for a second, half expecting to hear something behind us. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a sound to let us know they hadn't stopped. Hassan called the police immediately. Within 15 minutes, 2 squad cars arrived. The officers listened carefully as we described the men, the kayak, the bags. I admitted we had trespassed. At that point, it didn't matter. What mattered was whether we had been seen clearly, whether those strangers knew where we came from. The officers checked the perimeter of our yard with flashlights. That's when one of them called out. There were muddy footprints near the back fence. They led up to it and stopped. A few days later, the area around the reservoir was closed off for investigation. Rumors spread quickly, but no clear explanation was ever made public. For months afterward, every sound after midnight made me alert. I'd lie in bed staring at my ceiling, listening to the quiet, waiting for an unforeseen sound to disrupt it. Because once you've seen something like that, once you realize how easily a quiet place can hide something you don't understand. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe and step back into the dark with me next time. You never know when another stranger might be waiting just beyond the door.